flying low under the radar, like a Nighthawk stealth plane. You are hiding out in the shadows, keeping from the light of day. Nobody should ever have to live that way. Hey now, it's okay now. You don't have to hide from the world no more. Hey now, it's okay now. It's your time to soar.
Hi, y'all. I'm Mary. Thanks so much for joining this session today. I hope you enjoy that song as much as I do. I just love the idea of taking that place of starting out in the shadows and really moving it to somewhere that you want to soar. And I think of our English language learners who are often hiding in the classroom. They don't have the confidence. Their affective filter is not low enough yet. They're full of anxiety. And how do we move them into that place where they can soar in class? So we'll be learning a bit about that today, and I hope you have some good strategies by the end of this. So again, I'm Mary DeSimone. I am an education consultant. I spent 20 years in the classroom as an instructional coach for English learners, and then finally as a district administrator. Most recently, I've taken my education and travel, and I put those two together. I've been to Peru and then to Guatemala this past fall to do some teacher trainings there. Anytime I can get to speak on stage about the benefits of multilingualism and supports we can give to our students, I am more than happy to do that. And then across the bottom of the page, you see my dog here. This is Willow. So a few years ago, right after she tore some of the stuffing out of our bed comforter. So what I love here is that we both have a growth mindset, and I became a better dog mom, and she is now much better trained. And then up top here, this is my husband, Steve, and we are from Massachusetts, and we love, no matter the weather, to be outside and enjoying the seasons. So what I hope to cover today in this session is to explain to you the identification process for English learners. How do they get into your classroom, and how do they get that label? And by the end, I want you to be able to implement 3 strategies to support those L's in your classroom. We'll be talking about a few more, but there should be at least 3 that you can take away. So we're going to start by looking at who are our English learners. Then we're going to take a little glimpse into second language acquisition. So while you're not the L teacher, you are teaching the language of your curriculum. And then finally, we're going to look at those ways to support our L's in the classroom. So congratulations, you are a classroom teacher. It is such an exciting time. It's one of the best things I have done is working in the classroom. Some facts here that you might not know. There are 5.1 million English learners in US public schools. And I should say this is national data from 2019. So currently there's even more, right? The population is growing. And again, in 2019, 64% of teachers have at least one L in their classroom. So the likelihood that you will have L's in your classroom, or probably do now, is quite high. And North Carolina in 2019, 8% of their students were L's. So this is a growing population. So welcome to our class today. If you have not yet downloaded or put the note catcher up online so you can follow along with us, please do, because your first assignment here is going to be a writing assignment. So find that place in your note catcher, and you'll see it's going to ask you to write 3 sentences. What I would like you to do is think about the past weekend. Where did you go? What did you do? Who were you with? And I'd like you to write 3 sentences in your note catcher. but you cannot use the letter N. That's right. As you're writing, do not use the letter N in any of those words in your sentences. So I'm going to give you about a minute now to do that writing. So can you feel that cognitive demand on your brain, right? Your brain is working a little bit differently. The language isn't coming as easily, perhaps. I want you to think about our English language learners who don't have the linguistic repertoire. They don't have the vocabulary. They don't have the grammar structures that we have as native speakers. What are they going through every time that they try to express themselves or to take in information? Right? As English speakers, we quickly can see, instead of saying the words, I need or I went, maybe we say, I have to, or I visited, right? And this is just social language. And nobody's watching you. There's no pressure. Nobody's going to check your writing. There's low anxiety for this. But you can imagine if there's this constriction on the vocabulary and the structures you can use, what that's going to do to a student in the classroom. So take a minute and think too, how does it make you feel? Were you frustrated? Were you upset that you couldn't get things out? And how is this reflecting on our English learners as well? You probably thought something like, I know it sounds like I'm a 3-year-old, but actually I know this in my language, right? So we have a lot of students who have their knowledge of what we're teaching in their first language. They just don't have the proficiency in English language yet. And imagine how frustrating that is when they can't express themselves and they can't intake all of that information that you're trying to teach them. So that's where we're going to get with giving students supports, both for understanding what we're teaching and expressing what they want to say to us. So let's take a step back first and see, who are these English language learners? How do they get that label and how do they qualify for extra supports? So federally, we all go through the same process. Every time a student enrolls in a school system, they're given a home language survey. If on the home language survey, the parents answer or guardians answer that there's no other language than English noted. For example, there's no other language than English in the home. The student has no other language that they speak than English, and the parents don't have a first language other than English. Then the student is labeled not an English learner, and they continue with the enrollment process in the school system. However, if the parents or guardians do note on any of those questions that there is another language, the student is then given a language assessment. From the assessment, the school will determine if the student qualifies or doesn't qualify for L services. If they have a high enough proficiency to be successful in academic classes without support, they do not qualify for L services and they're labeled not English learner. But keep in mind, just because a student is labeled a non-English learner or not an English learner, it doesn't mean that English is their first language. So there still could be some difficulties that they're having in some language work that has to be done. On the other hand, if a student does qualify for L services, that means that they don't yet have enough proficiency in English to be in an academic classroom without support. The initial identification is one piece of it. There's also an annual identification for our English learners. Once they're labeled English learner, the parents and guardians can either decide to opt out of services, or they can decide to accept services for English language development. And typical services are pull out, the English language teacher pulls them out of the classroom. You might have push in, an English teacher comes into the classroom and works with you and the students in your content area. And then there's also bilingual and co-teaching models. No matter what the parents and guardians choose, students are always going to have their annual language test, which is the access test. In that test, just like the intake test, is going to determine if the students have enough proficiency to be considered former English learners, and then they'll be monitored for 4 years to make sure that they truly are being successful in the classroom. Or it might show that they still need to work on their English proficiency and they qualify for continued L services. Now, when we start talking about English learners, we use all sorts of terminology, and it's constantly changing. So as language professionals, you would think that we could decide on something and stick with it so everybody would understand. But language is really a living thing, and we're always trying to get these better definitions and terms out. So in North Carolina, you typically use EL for English learner. Some movement is going to ML, which is multilingual learner. You'll see both of those. And then in the classroom, for the ESL teachers, it's either ESL, English as a second language class, or ELD, English language development. In your workbook, again, there's a whole page of some of this terminology defined. So you can look at it there. As you continue working with these students, you'll learn more and more of this. If somebody says a word that you don't understand, stop them and ask them what it means, because it's constantly changing, like I said. And with that, let's take a quick peek at second language acquisition. There's a few things you need to know as a classroom teacher on second language acquisition. And the first is the types of language that students are using. BICS is one type. It's called Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills. And honestly, I don't think anybody remembers what BICS stand for. We just say BICS and we say CALP. But that's basically your playground language. It's the social language that kids are using, as opposed to CALP. CALP is the Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. And that really talks about the language of school, right? So think of the vocabulary that you're teaching in school, maybe like excerpt, density, trait, dividend. These are things that we're not talking about around the dinner table. Kids aren't getting practice with those words at home. They're really specific to school. And as they broaden their repertoire, they're going to be growing more in that way. So those are two types of language to look at. And then there's these five stages of language learning, which were created by Stephen Krashen, one of the lead researchers in L education. So the first stage is pre-production. And again, head into your note catcher because there's a graph here you can fill out to capture some of this information. Pre-production is also known as the silent period. So for maybe 0 to 6 months, the students could have a silent period, and it really varies. As I give you these timeframes, it's very dependent on an individual child. A child might come in and be willing to talk right away because that's just their personality. Others might take a longer time and just be listening for quite a while. At this stage, the student has minimal comprehension. They're not verbalizing. They're maybe nodding yes or no. They're drawing things and pointing to things. But as far as their language production, that's where they are. The second stage is called early production, and that can last between 6 months to a year. At this time, the student has limited comprehension. They're producing 1 or 2 word responses, using keywords or familiar phrases. They're just using the present verb tense, but they are able to understand with support and produce with support. The third stage is called speech emergence. That's a good 1 to 3 year stretch. Kids spend a lot of time here. They have good comprehension. They're producing simple sentences. They're learning the grammar, but they're still making grammar mistakes and pronunciation mistakes, completely natural. They're getting better and better at expressing themselves. They still need supports from the classroom teacher. And you might find that they're frequently misunderstanding jokes or the slang that's being spoken, but they're progressing quite a bit in their English. Then we come to intermediate fluency. That's at about 3 to 5 years. You're going to see that the students have excellent comprehension, especially with their BICS, with their social language. They're making just a few grammatical mistakes, but it's not interrupting what they're trying to say. They can still communicate well with that. And then finally, stage 5 is advanced fluency. And with strong language teaching and preparation, that's about 5 to 7 years. It can take longer if there's not strong language supports in the classroom and in the school. And at this stage, it's really a near native speech that the students have. They may still have an accent, which there is absolutely nothing wrong with an accent. So with that in mind, let's check out your classroom and how this is going to relate to our language learners. So first and foremost, before we go back into the language piece of it, let's just talk about a welcoming environment for all students, right? We want to make sure we're building community and equity, that our students are feeling seen and safe and valued. And English learners, just like all other learners, need this as well. So a few things that you can do: learn the correct pronunciation of names, right? We want to honor our students and where they come from and really work on pronouncing their names correctly. And if we struggle with it, ask them for help. They are more than willing. I learned in my many years of trying to do this that there are a few vowel sounds that I just cannot make. But my students kept trying to teach me and would help me, and they knew I was making the effort. And for that, they respected that. And, we laughed together when I couldn't speak in their language as well. And they tried to pronounce my name, but we knew that we were really trying for each other and respecting. And that's what mattered. Learn a few words in their language. If you can say good morning or have a good day or how are you, that's going to put a huge smile on their face. And they'll know that they are seen and their culture is seen by you. With all students, building relationship is key. Doing some interest surveys, trying to find out what they like and who they are is going to be huge. And then embracing diversity, right? We want to be asset-based. We know that every student brings something to the class, and diversity is really a strength in our classroom. A quick aside for an easy diversity inclusion piece: students love the music from their culture. If you could have students bring in some music from different cultures, perhaps playing it while they're working or explaining it to the other students, it's just a nice way, a nice easy way to bring some culture into the classroom. And then below here, in big letters, I have the affective filter. So I remember learning the affective filter in graduate school, and a light bulb went off for me. It's basically this idea of how a student's attitude and environment is going to affect how they're learning. So if they are in an environment that is comforting, that is safe, that accepts errors and progress, they're going to have a lower affective filter, meaning they're going to be more at ease taking risks in learning. On the other hand, if a child is in an environment and they're surrounded by negative feelings, such as lack of motivation, they're going to lose their self-confidence, they're going to have high anxiety for things, and this is really going to obstruct their learning. Their brain's not going to be able to take in information as well, nor are they going to be able to produce information as well. So for all students, this welcoming environment, the supports we're going to look at is really going to help their affective filter and therefore help their brain with learning. Now let's look at the roles that we have of a classroom teacher and the English learner teacher. The two roles are separate, but they do merge together, and collaboration is really the key for success for our language learners. So a classroom teacher, their goal is to give students access to the grade level content curriculum. You're following the content standards of your state, you're teaching the language of your content, and you're differentiating instruction, considering both content and language demands. The English learner teacher, their goal is to prepare students for grade level curriculum and attend to the social language. So we're looking at the language standards from WIDA. So we have our own standards that we have to teach that go through cross-curricular academic language. So we might be thinking about things like cause and effect, compare and contrast, how to make introductions, how to increase rigor in the language. And then we're also looking at 4 domains: speaking, listening, reading, and writing, and 3 dimensions of language, moving from the word level to the sentence level to the discourse level, really going from vocabulary to some grammar, and then how do we put that all together into paragraphs, and finally essays. So you can see there's crossover in what we are both doing, and collaboration is truly the way to make this work for our students and for ourselves. So take out this example. This is an 8th grade math teacher who I worked with, and her content objective was to explain how you solved the equation. We were working on equations together, and we needed to be able to write out the steps for solving the equation. So together with the classroom teacher, we found the vocabulary that students would need to use in their explanations. I created for her a poster for the classroom that had labels for these different pieces of the equation. And it was for all students, not just our language learners. Everybody used this as we began to describe how we were solving a problem. We then took the time to really think about how do we want them to explain their solutions. So as the L teacher, I taught some sequence language to the students. First, next, then, and last would be for the beginners. And then we moved on to higher levels of sequence language later. And I also taught the language of explain. What does it mean to explain? And we worked through, again, some of the specific vocabulary like distribute, combine like terms, move variables to one side of the equation. And we worked on how can this all come together for our students so that they can take their knowledge and show us in spoken English and in written English that these are the steps that they used. So you can see here a good example of the language demands being supported and the content needs of the students being met as well. Now, without all of this support and understanding of what our students need, there can be a real heartbreaking situation, I would say. And this quote really captures it for me. This is by Tan Hyun, who is a blogger of ELS and has just really intelligent things to say. Here he says, "Nothing robs students of their enthusiasm for school more than the inability to understand instructions. Schools become isolating and disempowering places when the students are unable to participate in activities with their peers." This is part of a mission statement, right? We don't want our students to feel like this. You may have seen some students who have felt like this, and our job is to really make these students and all students included in what we're doing. It is on us to make the lessons comprehensible and to do as much as we can until they understand and can participate in what we are doing. There's a few things that we can do very strategically to make sure that they do understand what's going on in class. This is called comprehensible input, and it's ways that we're going to do scaffolding and supporting for our students. There's a few things to keep in mind as you're considering what to do here. You want to know the background knowledge of your students and the language demands of the lesson you're teaching. Well, I said that in one brief sentence. That's actually quite an undertaking, and that's a really good place to partner with your L expert to find out what those things are, so you know what the needs are of your students. But once you have that, some of the ways that you can make your content comprehensible as you're speaking to them is by slowing down or making a really appropriate rate of speech. So if I were speaking to students who were new to English, I would slow down my rate of speech. Right, you can clearly see there's a difference with how I said that sentence. The other thing I'm changing is my clarity of speech. It is amazing how quickly we as native speakers will say some things and push our words together, right? Like I might ask, want to go to the park? Instead of want to, it's wanna. Our L's don't always know what that means. We say it so quickly. So think of the clarity of your speech as well. The next thing to consider is cognates. So cognates are words that are very similar in English and a student's first language. So if you have a Spanish speaker, you have the words like bank is banco, map is mapa, hotel is hotel. That might have been French, but whatever the language is, it's great if you can find those cognates and use them and make your students aware of them as well. Even ask them to look for cognates in the language so they can build their vocabulary more quickly. There's lots of different places online you can find cognates for the different languages of the students you have in class. And then don't be afraid of repetition. People do need to hear things a few times. You might give directions and then ask a student to give them back to you. That's going to allow both that student to make sure they understand, but your students in the classroom are also going to hear it for another time. In mentioning directions there, you want to make sure that your directions are clear in that you say your directions and you write your directions. That way your students have two types of input. They're both hearing it and reading it. Don't be afraid to use native language. If you know that students' native language, use that to help them, right? Bilingual is the goal. We're not trying to replace their native language with English. We want to keep that native language strong as well. And then finally, for the oral part of some of the supports, you want to make sure you chunk your content. So don't go on and on and on about something without stopping and letting students either discuss or write or draw or somehow interact with it, where you can check their understanding. On the other side of the page, we're talking about visuals. Visuals are obviously one of the best ways to get a quick understanding of what we're talking about. So that could be pictures, it could be multimedia, you might have videos of some things, label what you can. Modeling, of course, is one of the best things you can do as well. If you can show an example of what your expectation is. This goes back to the I do, we do, you do model of teaching, where students really get a good idea of what is needed. And then word walls. Have vocabulary, have a really print-rich environment. Word walls with pictures are even better. All of that is going to help your students as they're understanding and intaking your information. One other strategy that helps that I wanted to mention is these closed notes. So if you are teaching your students something and you want them to take down notes on it, we know that our English learners are still trying to capture the language, translate it, and understand it, write it down. That's a really huge cognitive demand on their brain. So having these partially created notes, closed notes, where they just need to write in some of the words is going to be a great support for them. It's also going to help you know that they have the correct notes and the complete notes, because you can see what they're writing down and it's just a few pieces. And obviously this example on literary summary, you could do it for anything and you can change how much or how little you're expecting the students to write. Now let's talk about the students communicating with us, right? So we also need to give them supports for output, whether they're speaking or writing or other, which we'll look at in a minute. So for speaking, one of the greatest things you can do is give students some wait time. If you ask a question in class, give them about 5 seconds just to think. For our native speakers, they're probably ready to yell out an answer, their hands are up. But for our English language learners, they need that time to take the question, understand it, perhaps translate it, think of the answer, get that ready to say in English, and then raise their hand to answer. So they just need that little bit of time. If we don't give wait time, it's going to be the native speakers or the kids who come to the answer right away. Those are the ones who are always going to be speaking out in class, and we don't want that. And again, using native language, if students are struggling in English to say the answer, sometimes they just need to say it in their native language. If you understand it, that's great. If a classmate understands it, they could help you as well. And a few other scaffolds for output. Word banks, just like we talked about the word wall that you could have with vocabulary, word banks being available as students are answering things is going to be a huge help for them. Here, for both speaking and writing, is an example of an assignment I had for compare and contrast. And I gave the students a list of words that go with compare, a list of words that go with contrast. And to make it a little more interesting, I told them that they must use the word though, because that's when we had been practicing, and they could not use the word but, because they used that all the time and they needed to up their vocabulary a bit more. So you can easily create something like this, and then below each of the word lists have a few sentence frames to show students how to use the words. Students don't have to use this support, but it's there if they need it. The other thing you might do is have a graphic organizer. So as they're starting to think about, in this case, character traits, and they write down the title of the book and the main character is, you're asking for 3 character traits, but you have a pretty specific sentence frame here with written underneath the blanks what students are supposed to put in. And can you imagine if you also had a word bank or a word wall with all the different character traits that you had gone over in class, maybe with some pictures explaining those as well? It's just these types of supports that you could do to help students with their thinking in their language. And then if you want them speaking about it after, let them take a minute to write, let them turn to a partner to share their ideas. Remember that affective filter? This is going to keep the affective filter low. It's going to lower the anxiety. It's going to help them either get the corrections they need or feel more confident in their answer. And then perhaps they're sharing out with the class. Some other supports for output, it doesn't always have to be just in speaking or in writing. So we could do total physical response, which in this picture you see 2 boys with their thumbs up, right, showing that they understand something. You could do thumbs up, thumbs sideways for I kind of get it, and thumbs down for oh no, I don't get this. And then mix it up. Have them put a hand on their head if they understand, or a finger on their nose if they have a question, right? It's going to practice body parts for some of the kids, and it's going to keep them engaged because they don't know exactly what to expect each time. Another way to communicate what you know is through drawing. So an alternative response to a question is perhaps drawing something like this, maybe the weather cycle, right? So the students maybe can't tell you in a full paragraph what the weather cycle is, but they can draw the pictures. And then the next step would be adding labels to the pictures. And then the next step would be writing sentences with those labels. They're working here in a small group so they can help each other, even in their first language, if they share a first language, and then they can help each other with how to say that in English. And eventually that's going to grow to where they can write the sentences with less support and eventually write a paragraph about it. Another quick way to communicate knowledge is through these task cards, or response cards, I should say. Right, so every student in my class would have a card on a ring binder, binder ring, I think it's called. So they would have their ABCD card for if we're doing something multiple choice, and they would have their TF cards for true and false, and then they always had a question mark card in case they didn't know the answer and needed a little extra help. But this is a great way for students who all want to participate. Maybe they don't want to raise their hands right now, but everybody in the classroom can show you either true or false or the correct letter for multiple choice. That's giving you a really quick assessment of where they are, and it's allowing your English learners to participate with a pretty low output of language. Now we need to think about, as we're doing this, balancing the effective filter and rigorous expectations, right? So we want to provide many, many opportunities to practice meaningful language in the classroom. So the only way our students are going to learn is through practice. And we have to both support them and challenge them. I think sometimes the outcome that we don't want that happens is we're trying to protect our language learners, and we don't want to make it too hard for them. We want them to feel successful, and we can end up lowering the rigor and lowering our expectations for them. Instead, we want to lower their anxiety, right? Lower the effective filter, give them the supports they need, but still expect the output from them that is high expectations, is some grade level content work, because they can do that with the right supports. And it's on us to continue learning as the teachers what supports they need, what we can put in place, and how we can help them express what they know. And part of that is in our assessments. So we're assessing content separate from language. Like in the math example we saw, we can see that a student really was able to understand the math and solve the problem, but perhaps they needed help on the language demand of how to explain that solution to the problem and how to explain the steps. So with more and more practice and with collaboration with an L teacher, that's something that you're going to continue working on with your students. Some great things for this are to keep up the rigor and the expectations, are allowing the students like to do that turn and talk. As I said before, work in a small group so that they build up their confidence before they're doing some full class activities where they're expected to speak in front of the entire class. So let's head back to the beginning where we started, to the welcome to class. Now imagine I had given you some of these supports at the beginning. I gave you over here on the right a list of words that you could use. None of these words have N in them. I gave you some past tense verbs that you could use as you explained or wrote about what you did over the weekend. And I gave you some sentence starters that would help. I gave you some words that you can't use because they have N in them, right? So Sunday is one of the words you can't use. So perhaps we say the day after Saturday or the next day, right? There's different things that we can give our students to help them get around the words that they're struggling with. And then another thought. Imagine if I said, not only could you not use the letter N, but you also can't use the letter T or R. That puts on a whole new cognitive load to what you're doing. And that's what a lot of our emerging speakers are facing, right? Again, you have the knowledge of what you did over the weekend, but that language is not there yet. You don't have the proficiency. And this represents for us as we're doing it, the vocabulary, right? You're not using an N, a T, or an R in words, but this also represents for our language learners, the grammar structures. How do I put a sentence together? It represents how do I put a paragraph together and sound fluent and sound like I make sense as opposed to very choppy. It's going to add a different dimensions to what our students are looking at. And what if I added some more wait time? I gave you time to think as well. That could help you. That could lessen the anxiety of what you're doing and what your task is. Right? And think the more confident you are with those 3 sentences that you wrote down after you had time and support to do them, you'd probably be much more likely to share out when it came time to share out with the rest of the class. So we're coming to the end of this, and I'd like you just to take a moment of some personal reflection. I often use this at the end because I really think it shows some of the changes and the things that we can do from some learning that has just taken place. So the frame is, I used to think, but now I think. So next I will. And again, we're still in our note catcher. And I'd like you to think about and write down a word or two. What did you used to think about L's in the classroom? And then what are some new thoughts that you have or some new learning that took place? And then, as I said in the beginning, our goal, one of our goals was to come up with 3 strategies that you could put into practice right away. So after the so next I will, what are 3 things that you will commit to doing to support your L's in the classroom? And as you write these, remember the supports might be specifically for language learning, but they truly are helping all of your students in the classroom. So as we finish, I would just like to say thank you so much for your attention. I am excited for you as teachers with L's in the classroom. It is such an exciting experience, one of the best jobs I have had. And I can't wait for you to experience that as well if you're not already. If I can help you in any way, here's all my contact information. Please reach out. I answer my emails. I will be happy to have you follow me on Facebook. I try to put things up there and on Instagram to support teachers. So connect with me. I would love to stay in touch and see how you are doing. And I wish you best of luck in your classrooms. Thanks so much, everybody.